Welcome back to the Odyssey Academy, and this is lesson 4 on creativity and brainstorming. So in lesson 3, we talked about the long-term problems, and by now, hopefully you've selected one that you'd like to solve. So we're not quite ready to solve the long-term problem just yet. So to give you some tools on how to actually go about coming up with creative ideas, lesson 4 is all about what creativity actually is and some tools to help you develop creative ideas or brainstorming. So the agenda for today is to talk about what creativity actually is, talk about how we store information in associative networks. We'll talk about what brainstorming is. We'll present you with some brainstorming tools that you and your team can use to come up with new ideas. And then finally, we'll wrap up the conversation with this idea of limitations, boundaries, and their relationship with creativity. I hinted at this in a prior video, talking about how introducing limitations actually tends to make us more creative. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what exactly that looks like. So let's start with this general question: is what is creativity, right? Now, if we went out and asked people what is creativity, we'd probably get a lot of different answers. So maybe someone would say it's thinking outside the box. Maybe someone would say it's creating or something new, being inventive, innovation, artistic, coming up with something new, being original, pushing boundaries, imagination, inspiration, expressing yourself. And the truth is, creativity is sort of all of these things, right? So certainly it's something outside of the box, it's innovation, you're pushing boundaries, and that's great. But like any word, creativity actually has a formal definition. Like there's a formal way to think about what creativity actually is and whether or not something is in fact creative. So the theme that we got out of those free responses a second ago, most people, when you ask what creativity is, tend to say something along the lines of originality, something we haven't seen before, something brand new, something innovative. So oftentimes that's the word that comes up, original. And it turns out, according to a formal definition of creativity, and we're citing some work here from the Creativity Research Journal, originality is a component of creativity. So if you said originality, points for you. But here's the thing, creativity is not just about originality, it's also about effectiveness. And this is the piece that people tend to forget or not think about. If something is original, that's great, that's part of it, but it is not enough, it's not sufficient to make it creative. If something is creative, it's both original and innovative, but it's also effective. It performs some task, it serves some function, and it does it well, right? That's the idea of being effective. So again, when we think about creativity in the scientific world, the professors that research this stuff, creativity is defined as being a combination of originality and effectiveness. If you only have one or the other, if you have an effective tool, that's great, but if it's not original, it's not creative. Similarly, if you have a tool that's original, but doesn't actually work, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it's great that it's original, but it's not creative, right? So creativity is a function of originality and effectiveness. So keep that in mind throughout OM and throughout life, right? If something is truly creative, that means that it's original, innovative, new, that it also works and gets the job done. So to kind of break it down for you here, again, something that is strong in originality is something that's novel, you've not seen it before, it's unusual maybe, or unique in some way. All that falls under originality. And the effectiveness piece is it's appropriate for the job that it's serving, it's relevant to the context, and it's useful, right? So originality is all about novelty, uniqueness, and being unusual. Effectiveness is about being appropriate, relevant, and useful. So again, if you only have one or the other, it's fine. You don't actually have something that's truly creative. And why that's important to know is that in OM, we're trying to teach you how to be creative. So we want you to be an original thinker, but we also want to make sure the ideas that you think of that are original get the job done. That's important. And if you have those creative skills, it's going to serve you so well in school, when you go out to your job in the real world. Being a creative thinker, you'll come up with original ideas and that serve some purpose. So your company will reward you handsomely for these innovative ideas that also achieve whatever the business goals are, perhaps at your company. So just be thinking about that. Creativity is a function of originality and effectiveness. So the way I like to teach this when I'm teaching students about creativity is asking questions, right? So if we come up with a new device or a new prop or a new costume, whatever the case may be, particularly in OM, for originality, we can look at the device, the prop, the costume, whatever, and say, have we seen this idea before, right? So if I held up a hammer and I said, okay, I made this hammer, it looks the exact shape as any other hammer you'd buy at the grocery store, and I asked the question, have I seen this before? The answer is, yeah, like go to any Home Depot and you'll see a hammer that looks like that. not particularly original, right? But if I created something that does not look like a hammer and functions in a very different way, then I can successfully say that we haven't seen the idea before, it is original, and that chalks up some points for creativity. Second question, for the effectiveness, does this idea get the job done, right? So let's use our hammer example again. If the goal of the hammer, the effectiveness of the hammer involves getting nails into a board, if it doesn't do that, it could be original, but if it doesn't hammer nails into a board, it's not particularly effective, right? So the creativity points suffer. However, if it looks original and it also does the job of getting nails into a board, then it's effective. So it's original and effective, therefore it's creative. So again, creativity is about originality and effectiveness. Keep that in mind throughout. If we return to a more sophisticated example, so let's go back to our crossing the pond example we talked about a couple of lessons ago. We have a rowboat, right? So the rowboat will get us from one side of the pond to the other. If we ask our questions, is this particularly original? The answer is no, it's not. And is it effective? Have we seen this idea before? Original, no. And is it effective? Does it get the job done? The answer is yes, right? So it actually gets us from point A to point B. So just to clarify, ask the questions here. Have we seen this idea before? Is it original? The answer is no. Does it get the job done? Yes. So is the rowboat creative? Not exactly, right? Because it's not a particularly original solution to get us from point A to point B across either side of the pond. However, is it effective? Does it get us across the pond? I hope so, right? So yes, it's effective, but no, it's not original. But now let's take a look at a different idea. So this idea actually comes from one of the original Odyssey of the Mind problems from way, way, way back when. It was called Renaud Trefusca. We'll talk more about this. But the idea, the challenge that Dr. Sam, who created the program, had for his students was they had to cross a small body of water. And one of the students created this device. And this device was inspired by a water strider, like a little spider that crosses the water, using its legs for surface tension, or surface support, I suppose. So the idea here is that they were building a device inspired by a spider that could go across, an insect that could go across water, as a new way of getting across the pond. So in this case, is this idea original? Well, yeah, like we've not seen something quite like this before, right? It's inspired by nature, but nobody's ever actually attempted to make this device. So it's original. And then of course, is it effective? Does it get you across the pond? Yes, it might take a little bit more work physically than getting you across on the rowboat, but clearly, I think that's William there, is sitting on the device and is elevated above the water. So it's effective. He's not in the water. He's not gotten wet, right? So as long as he can get across to the other side, then the device would be effective. So original, effective, creative, right? That's what we're looking for. So let's go through a series of questions, and I want you to tell me which one you think is more creative in terms of originality and effectiveness. So let's say the team in a long-term problem is required to write a song. Which one is more creative to you? Option A is a parody song, which means we've taken a song and just changed the lyrics, an existing song and just changed the lyrics. Or the team sits down and creates an original team-created song. So they write new music, they write new lyrics, and that's the song. Which one's more creative to you? Hopefully you said an original team-created song, right? Parody songs are fine and they serve a point, but it's not particularly original, right? Because you're taking somebody else's music and just kind of using it as your own, even if you're coming up with new words for it, right? Is it effective? Well, it's a song. So if the problem asks for a song, it's done that, but it's not very original, right? So the more creative response here would be an original team-created song. Which is more creative? A remote control toy car or a car made from scratch? Okay, so say we're doing the vehicle problem, we're required to have these cars that perform tasks. We are allowed, in the rules it says we can use commercially made parts from a remote controlled vehicle if we want, or we can create the car from scratch. Which one feels more creative to you? Probably the car made from scratch, right? So why? Well, because the remote control car, even if it gets the job done, even if it's effective, it's not particularly original, right? So there are a number of remote control cars out there that we could have used, but the car made from scratch, if it's using original ideas, components coming together that the team has put together, therefore, of course, it's just more creative because it's more original in terms of our originality, effectiveness definition of creativity. Which one is more creative, using Mickey Mouse in a skit or using a new character named Peter Parrot in a skit? By now, you're getting the hint. Yeah, we could use famous people or famous characters in a skit, not particularly original, so you might get some points taken away or not get all your points awarded to you for creativity, just because it's lacking the originality piece, all right? Okay, which is more creative? A costume made from candy wrappers taped together or a costume made from candy wrappers cut into tiny pieces and reformed into a new material? All right, so this is a tough one, right? Because they're both pretty creative. Okay, so in this case, both of these are pretty original, right? It's not every day that we see costumes that are made out of, candy wrappers. At least I don't. But in terms of effectiveness, does it actually get the job and cover the context? In the context of what the problem is. They're both costumes, so they're both covering up, the person. They're a costume that's to be worn. But in this case, there's something special about taking the candy wrappers, cutting them into tiny pieces, and then creating a new material. So that's more points for that originality, right? So even though they're both original, this is like relatively more original. And in terms of effectiveness of creating a costume, well, if you're able to take those candy wrappers and form them into a material that's more easily to work with to create a costume, that's actually more effective in creating the shape and texture and look of the costume than just simply taping candy wrappers together, which still creates a costume, but maybe isn't as effective as making it look like an actual costume, like fabric, right? In this case, if you could take the second case, if you can take the pieces and actually mold them into a material that makes them more likely to look like a sophisticated costume, well, it's both more original and more effective, right? And that makes it more creative. So just know creativity has a definition that includes originality and effectiveness. And anytime you're solving the problem, you should be asking yourself, is this idea original and is it effective? Does it get the job done in terms of what we're looking for? All right, so moving on, what is brainstorming? So brainstorming and creativity are also often talked about in the same breath. So let's talk a bit about what brainstorming actually is. So it's a process for dreaming up ideas, right? For coming up with new ideas. It's a judgment-free activity, which means you can share your ideas and not be afraid that your team members are going to put you down for your idea. It's a collaborative effort, right? So your team works together to come up with these new ideas during a brainstorming session. It's an inspiring exercise, right? So maybe your team member gave a solution or gave a suggestion or an idea, and that made you think of something in your own mind. So there's this inspirational quality about brainstorming that we can work together and build something great and come up with new ideas by piggybacking off of one another. What does science actually tell us about brainstorming? So just like creativity, there are researchers and professors that study creativity all day long and have been studying it for years. There are people who study brainstorming and how we actually come up with new ideas. So there's some conflicting perspectives on how brainstorming works or what's better or what's worse. But I do want to point out a few interesting highlights from the research so that you know how to be a better brainstormer. Or if you're a coach or a parent, how to be a better teacher in terms of getting brainstorming sessions to be successful for your students. So one myth is this idea that there are no bad ideas in brainstorming, right? So we often say there's no bad idea in brainstorming. What we mean by that, at least what I mean by that, is of course there can be a bad idea in brainstorming, right? If you have a student or you are just coming up with ideas that are completely irrelevant to the task at hand, those ideas are not at all effective because they're irrelevant and out of context. It's fine. Of course, we want to like not put any crazy boundaries on the answers that people are providing in a brainstorming session. But if a particular student is just continuously giving ideas that are in no way relevant to the problem at hand, that's not effective brainstorming. So again, we want to be as open to as many ideas as possible, even if they seem kind of out there, but we want to make sure that we're serving our purpose of coming up with ideas that are original and are effective. So they're still contextually relevant to whatever the problem is that we're solving. So again, that's not to say that there are definitely bad ideas in brainstorming. There are better ideas than others. And we want to make sure that we try to keep the brainstorming focused. Again, not to limit ideas or the creativity of ideas, but just to make sure that we're actually coming up with enough material from which to choose in our brainstorming session. That's what we mean by that. The other problem that comes up in brainstorming is the notion of groupthink. What tends to happen is when you bring a team of people together and you have them brainstorm, maybe somebody says like a really good idea and everyone gets excited about it and everyone sort of coalesces around that idea. The problem with this isn't that it's a good idea or a bad idea, it's that then suddenly we stop thinking of new ideas and new options, right? So that may very well be a good idea, but maybe there are other really good ideas out there. Remember our spirit of divergent thinking in OM? So the moment we kind of coalesce around one idea, this notion of groupthink, then suddenly we're stuck and we're not actually really engaging in the brainstorming process with respect to its purpose, which is coming up with many, many ideas. All right, the other problem that tends to come up is sometimes not all ideas are given equal consideration in a group setting. So if we have all 7 team members, it can be possible that 1 or 2 members of the team are dominating the brainstorming conversation. So the way we get around this, of course, is having systematic ways to present ideas. So like games or tools or activities for brainstorming that ensures that everyone has equal say, everyone has equal time to give his or her ideas, so that not one or two people, no one or two people dominate the conversation. So here's what the management literature would say about brainstorming. The first thing you want to do is articulate the problem. What are we brainstorming about? Is it song ideas? Is it costume ideas? Is it overall theme ideas for the solution to our problem? So you would articulate the problem. And then, this is important, you would encourage each of your individual team members to brainstorm their own solutions, right? We're not talking about it yet. We're just coming up with our own individual ideas separately, right? Then what we do is we'll come together after we've individually brainstormed our ideas to whatever problem we've designated in step one. And each person is allowed to share his or her ideas, and each one is giving substantive conversation. So it's not like one person dominates or one idea we spend 30 minutes talking about and the others we spend like a minute talking about. No, there's a set time and every idea gets equal consideration at this point of the process. Now, here's the important part. A lot of teams stop right here and make a decision. What the literature suggests is you should separate again, right? So maybe you shared all your ideas among the entire group. What the researchers would say is, cool, now don't make any decisions, separate, let everybody kind of stew over those ideas, let them kind of sit in your head for a little bit, maybe have a week go by, like have a night's rest, whatever the case may be. And then after you've had time to think about all the possible solutions that have come up, come together as a group, reconvene and discuss to determine which solution you want to move forward with, right? So that's kind of the ideal version of brainstorming. Any variation of this is totally acceptable, by the way. It's just that this is what the science suggests is a more effective way to do it. All right, so here's a specific brainstorming tool that you and your team can use as you're trying to come up with solutions for your long-term problem. So one is what's called circle share. So what you're going to do is you're going to identify the problem, just like the science suggests. So whatever it is you're trying to solve. What's the theme? What kind of approach do you want to take? Who do you want to have play this character? What should this character be like? Anything, any idea, any problem you have, you can brainstorm about. So you just want to make sure you identify so everyone's on the same page about what they should be thinking about. Identify what that problem is so everyone knows what to be thinking about. So then you want to take like 3 minutes to think quietly, right? So this is not a group exercise. At this point, you just want to kind of like sit in your quiet and think, okay, if this is the problem we're solving, what are some solutions I could come up with, right? If we're brainstorming, how do we want to keep our backdrop standing right now? It's made from sheets. I would take 3 minutes to think about, okay, I could use poles, I could use a pulley system, I could create a wooden backdrop. So I'm gonna start brainstorming those ideas on my own. And then after those 3 minutes are over, we're gonna go clockwise around the table. You can start with anybody you want, and everyone gets to share one answer that they've come up with in their thinking time, right? So I might say curtain rods, and then it goes around the table and I might say wooden columns that we've created. Goes around the table and I might say poles from a store display, right? So come up with all the different ideas that you possibly have. You can't pass, right? So say anything, make a contribution to your team that's addressing the problem that's been outlined. Have somebody write down the ideas the whole time. So maybe one of your team members or you is writing down the ideas. And then do this for 5 minutes, right? Go around the table as many times as you can in 5 minutes. And afterwards, after you've written down all the ideas, then give some time and then you can discuss all the ideas that have been developed, right, as a team. So again, this is a general tool that you can use to address any problem you have in OM and also in life, right? If you're working with a team of people, you can use Circle Share to come up with a bunch of ideas. And the best part is this Circle Share, this particular approach was inspired by spontaneous. So when we get to spontaneous, we'll have a whole lesson on spontaneous, but essentially Circle Share works very much like a spontaneous problem does on Odyssey Mind in terms of taking the time to think and then giving your feedback, giving your responses and your ideas in a timely manner. All right, so another brainstorming tool I have for you in this lesson is what's called mind mapping. So just so you know, the way the brain stores information is in these associative networks, right? So I don't want to get into the science of it too much, but your brain doesn't work like a computer where you have like file folders and like sub-file folders. Your brain essentially stores concepts, and those concepts are loosely related in your brain. Things that are more similar, so let's say like, I don't know, monkeys and bananas, things that we associate together, tend to have a stronger associative relationship, like their network is closer together than, let's say, I don't know, monkeys and potato chips, right? I don't really think about those two things together, so that association would be farther apart. So the way this works is that if a central concept is activated, like if I said to you zoo animals, then certainly certain types of zoo animals would pop up in your head, like monkeys, lions, tigers, bears, right? We're probably not thinking about domestic cats, right? Or fish tank fish that you have at home. So that's kind of the way the brain, in a very crude way, stores information, right? So it's a very basic description of how the brain stores information, but we can use this in terms of brainstorming. So what you see here is an associated network or a network map, an idea map, where if I said, hey, animals, that's our theme. What do you think of when you think of animals? And I did a free response. Somebody might say dogs, somebody might say zoo, somebody might say dragons, somebody might say stuffed toys. So the idea here is you want to write the central idea, whatever it is you're brainstorming on, in the middle circle. So that's where animals is. And then step 2 is you're going to think of what else comes to mind. So when I say animals, what comes to mind? As I said, somebody says dogs, zoos, dragons, stuffed toys. Great. So we're going to make new circles that come off of that central circle into smaller circles, as you can see here. And then we're going to connect those to that center circle, right? So dogs is connected to animals, zoos is connected to animal, and so on. Now what we would do is we'd go to each of those subcircles and come up with even more ideas. So if I were to say dogs, what do you think of? Maybe you think of barking. Maybe you think of taking walks. Maybe you think of dog treats. Maybe you think of dog houses. Maybe you think of Snoopy from Charlie Brown. Great. You would make little circles that stem off of dogs and write all of those things we just said in even smaller circles, right? Same thing for zoos. When I say zoos, you might think of lions. You might think of cages. You might think of snacks, right? You might think of shows. Sometimes they do like seal and dolphin shows, right? So you'd write those things in smaller circles coming off of zoos. Stuffed toys, you could write about that. So the idea is each of these subcircles you'd have even smaller circles coming off of, and that creates your overall mind map. Now, to give you a full example of a mind map, here's one. If vacation were our central theme, right? So we're brainstorming about vacations. What do you think of? Well, in this map, this group of people thought of activities. They thought of Tuscany, maybe that's where they were going, accommodation, so where they were staying, and also transportation, right? And then when we asked, okay, activity, what do you think of? They thought of trips and sports, which made them think of swimming and cycling, right? The trip made them think of the tickets. If we said, what do you think of when you think of transportation? They thought of car and plane. When they thought of plane, they thought of the specific airline, which was KLM. They thought of the tickets. There were 3 adults going, 1 child going. So that's how a mind map works. You start with the central idea, then you come up with the ideas around it, and then you come up with ideas around those subtopics as well. Now, why is this helpful when it comes to being creative? Well, let's say that there was an OM problem that required a vacation theme of some kind. Great. If everybody did just a pure vacation theme, then everyone might have like beaches and sunshine and they're, like laying out on the beach, and all of the solutions would be pretty much the same. However, if we do something like a mind map, let's say we created this mind map and we're solving an OM problem about vacation. Well, if we look down here to, let's say, transportation, rental, and there's Hertz, the rental car company. I think they misspelled it here. But we now are thinking, maybe we should do our solution about rental cars. And maybe it takes place not on the beach, but at the rental car company, and all the crazy things that can happen that are really funny that take place at a rental car company. Maybe it's a classics problem. So we're going to incorporate Greek mythology. It's Pandora's box, but it's set at a Hertz rental company at the airport, right? Like what ills can come out, what evils can come out of a rental car, just like Pandora's box from the original mythological story, right? So already we're kind of pushing the edge of what's expected. So we're coming up with an original solution that has nothing to do with beaches and sunshine because we're setting it in Hertz and the rental car place. And it's effective because it's going to solve the problem of, let's say, integrating a classic myth into a modern context. So Pandora's box at a rental car company, before a vacation. So that's the way we can use these mind maps, is to come up with ideas that are original, but also effective, that let us solve the problem that's before us. Same thing. So here's a mind map for air with a lot of nice illustrations. So when you think of air, these people thought of oxygen, rare gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrogen. And then from there, they thought of other things, right? So oxygen, they thought of respiration, they thought of burning, they thought of photosynthesis. So this is how a mind map works. Start with a central idea that you're brainstorming on, come up with the subtopics around it, and continue building that map into greater and greater detail until you have a lot more content to work with. Same thing here for summer, right? If there were a summer themed OM problem, yeah, we could just talk about summer. Or in this case, maybe you were thinking of 4th of July celebration and fireworks. Maybe it's a fireworks inspired theme. And that's really what we're going for, which makes it a bit more original, but as long as it solves the problem, is also effective. So therefore, originality, effectiveness, more creative. All right, cool. Now, I mentioned this in a previous lesson of why we have limitations, right? Why are there limitations? People tend to think that creativity is all about being wide open and having this blank canvas, right, to paint on, but that's not exactly how creativity works. So What I like to refer to this as is the blank canvas myth. Others have referred to it as a blank canvas myth as well. It's not a gym original, but the idea is that most people, if you ask them on the street, if you say, what is ideal for creativity? A blank canvas or a canvas that has certain limitations about it? People say, of course, the blank canvas, you can do literally whatever you want. But what we know to be true in the creativity research is that when we introduce some rules, some limitations, some boundaries, it forces us to have to be more creative, right? Originality is great. If we have a blank canvas, we can be more original. But with those rules, those imposed restrictions, then there's certain constraints that we have that in order to be effective, we have to go above and beyond on the originality. We have to find new ways to make sure the task gets done so that heightens originality and it heightens effectiveness. And when we heighten originality and effectiveness, we heighten creativity because that's what creativity is. All right, so some boundaries are good. And what's cool about your long-term problem, whichever long-term problem you've chosen, is there are already these restrictions built in, right? If you go to the section called limitations, those limitations are going to make you more creative. They require you to be more creative because they're restrictions, right? That's the whole idea. In addition to the problem-specific limitations, there's also the time limit for every problem. There's also the cost limit for every problem. So when you have time constraints and when you have resource constraints by way of cost and how much you can spend or what items you can use, all of those exist to help make you more creative, right? So don't be like, oh, I'm so frustrated. We only have 8 minutes, or we can only spend $120 on everything we're putting in the solution. That's actually a really good thing because it's teaching you how to be more creative. So it's teaching you that valuable life skill. All right, so the big takeaway there is boundaries force us to be more creative, which is important. If you remember bowling as a child, right? Remember the little bumpers that they put down on the side? Essentially, that's what the limitations do, right? Like we can't go too far in one direction because we have these boundaries and limitations. So we have to come up with new creative ways to solve the problem in spite of those limitations. All right, so think about how you can use this. Well, you can give yourself time limits when you're brainstorming. You can give yourself resource limits when you're brainstorming, right? Maybe you only have, you're writing your ideas down on index cards and you only get 3 index cards to write your ideas down on. Well, that's it. You don't have a whole stack that you can just come up with idea after idea after idea. Now we've imposed a constraint based on resources. Give yourself cost limits, right? So maybe there's already a cost limit in the problem, but if you want to even like shrink it down even further, that's going to force you to be more creative because you don't have the extra resources to spend on needless costumes and props and backdrops. Give yourself a certain style, right? So again, we'll talk about style in detail in a second, but if you were to give yourself a certain style, say film noir, like black and white detective, or maybe you're doing multicolored, let's go the opposite direction, right? If you can constrain yourself by your style, that's good because that's another forced boundary or constraint that's gonna force you to be more creative, right? If you're gonna create a costume and you're doing a film noir, black and white theme, guess what color your costume is going to be? Answer, it's not going to have color because it's going to be black and white, right? Conversely, if you decided to do a multicolor style for your theme, then if you're building a new backdrop, guess what? Your backdrop must be multicolored, right? Or should be multicolored to fit in with your style. So you can even use style as a way to enforce boundaries or limitations and help make your solution more creative. Of course, once you have these limitations and these rules in place, you're going to use them, adhere to them to make your solution even more creative because limitations, these boundaries, help us become more creative thinkers. All right, so real quick progress report on creativity and brainstorming. Do you know the 2 components of creativity? I hope you do. Originality is one, effectiveness is the other. Question 2, do you have some tools for brainstorming new ideas? We talked about circle share, we talked about mind mapping. These are 2 of many, many, many possible skills and tools you can use. I would encourage you to use these, look up others online. There are a bunch of brainstorming techniques that you can use, but just know that those tools are available and should be used as you go about solving your long-term problem. And then question 3, do you appreciate how limitations actually enhance creativity, right? So this goes back to the idea that a blank canvas is nice, but actually having restrictions and limitations will force us to be more creative, which is where a lot of our learning comes from in Odyssey of the Mind. All right, so looking at our checklist of what we've accomplished today, we have learned what creativity is and brainstorming tools, and it looks like next time we're actually going to talk about developing or beginning to develop the solution to your long-term problem, especially now that you have these tools for how to be more creative and how to brainstorm. So all that said, I'll see you next time.